there is a second process at work, as I mentioned, a process whereby Western institutions deteriorate. You can download the killer apps. You can also delete them. Or you can fail to upgrade them so that it stops working. I want to suggest to you that this is as powerful a force in the story of the Great Divergence, but unlike the downloading of the killer apps by the rest, the deterioration, or better expressed, degeneration of Western institutions is a deeply troubling phenomenon about which we should all worry. What do I mean by this? The title of my book, The Great Degeneration, is a pun on the word generation. As you know, Americans love to celebrate their role in World War II, an event at which they turned up rather late, with the phrase the Great Generation. The Great Generation is the generation that fought World War II. So the Great Degeneration is a pun on that phrase. And it's a pun inspired by the reality that in most Western societies, and particularly in the United States, a huge breach of contract between the generations is being perpetrated. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're young, and since I'm 49, that's practically all of you, if you're young, you should be very worried. You should be very worried indeed. Because your grandparents and parents around the world have been quietly living at your expense without admitting it. The great debates that rage in so many Western countries, not in resource-rich, fiscally prudent Norway, but believe me, almost everywhere else, debates about debt, about deficits, about entitlements, about austerity, about stimulus. All of this is noise. The signal behind the noise is a breach of contract between the generations. The baby boomers have been living for decades at the expense of the young and the unborn. Edmund Burke, the great Irish political philosopher, wrote in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, the real social contract is not between the classes or between the people and the sovereign, it is between the generations, between the living and the dead and the unborn. Throughout most of Western history, the living were respectful of that contract in both directions, mindful of the past, forever thoughtful of the future, saving for the future, investing for the future, innovating for the future, sacrificing for the future. Thrift, the whole point of thrift in the Victorian age was the future. At some point after 1945, the contract between the living and the unborn got broken, and the result we see today. According to the International Labour Organization, youth unemployment in the Eurozone is 23%. Americans think that this is a European problem, but the unemployment rate for young people in the United States is not much lower, it's 18%. Consumption per capita in the United States for the over 70s is twice consumption per capita for the under 20s. The same goes for government spending per capita. Government spends twice as much on the elderly per capita as on the young, on kids in the United States. If you wanted to achieve generational balance, that is to say, if you wanted to ensure that future generations paid the same amount of tax and received the same benefits as the current generation, here's what you would have to do in the United States. And I'll give the United States as an example, but I want to make it very clear that the same calculations could be made for most European countries and they would be equally horrible. Either you have to immediately and permanently cut all government spending by 35%, or you have to immediately and permanently increase all federal taxes by 64%. That is the only way, according to my good friend Larry Kotlikoff at Boston University, that you could achieve generational balance in the United States today. And if you don't do it, if you wait 10 years, you'll have to do even bigger cuts or even bigger tax hikes. That is the reality. Do not be deceived by the noise in the newspapers about sequesters and falling deficits and, oh, the fiscal problem's gone away. It hasn't. The magnitude of the fiscal problem is grossly understated by estimates of the debt to GDP ratio because they do not include the unfunded liabilities of Medicare, Social Security, and so on. And the same is true of most Western countries on the other side of the Atlantic. Who is more important, Granddad or Junior? Very few political posters convey questions like that. This will soon change. The fundamental conflict at the heart of most democracies today is between the generations. But we don't have the vocabulary to deal with this because our language is the language of class or the language of percentiles. Oh, I'm in the 1%. Oh, he's in the 47%. As if percentiles rule the world. But slowly, gradually, we must transition to a generation-based politics because the conflicts that are at the heart of our democracy are conflicts between the generations. Friedrich von Hayek, in The Constitution of Liberty, predicted in a not well-known passage that the welfare state would end this way, that the welfare state would turn out to be an enormous Ponzi scheme in which the elderly lived at the expense of the young. He was one of the very few writers in the 1950s to see this. But he was wrong about what would happen. Hayek said, remembering World War II, the young run the army and the police. At some point, they'll round up the elderly and put them into camps. Wrong. It's the young who've been rounded up and put into unemployment and put into the dependency culture of welfare. It's the young who are the losers, so far. That is the first example of institutional degeneration I want to talk about. The second is rather different.